Practice random acts of kindness and senseless acts of beauty. Perhaps you've heard or seen that phrase someplace or another over the years. I've seen the phrase practice random acts of kindness on bumper stickers, on mugs. I've heard it referred to in many, many articles. I decided to Google it to find out where it came from. And it came from a woman by the name of Ann Herbert back in the early 1980s. She was a woman of modest means, a house sitter at the time. And it came to her one day as she was sitting in a restaurant in Sausalito. And she wrote it down on her placemat and shared it with a fellow sitting nearby who also wrote it down. And he shared it with other people. It got some play in local California newspapers. But then in 1991, a feature article was done on Ann Herbert and this phrase by a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. And then it really moved around the country big time. Oprah had a show on it with people talking about random acts of kindness. A book was published by that title. There was even a Random Acts of Kindness Foundation formed, and we heard from them this morning in our Wisdom for All Ages. Interestingly, they don't accept any donations. They carry on kindness programs in schools and other places to get across this concept that whenever you want more of something, you just do it randomly, and acts of kindness will multiply. I went on their website the other day and found that during the pandemic, they're allowing anyone to download their various educational programs. But I've liked this phrase from the first time I saw it, and it hasn't been too prominent in the media in recent years, so I want to resurrect it. And of course, we're going to have more than one sermon this month on kindness. Donna Zaneski is also going to speak on happiness and kindness 2 weeks from now. So this is our kindness month here at our congregation. But this wonderful phrase, I think, acts as a counter to another phrase we all know, random acts of violence and senseless acts of destruction. It has something positive, I think, to say about human beings. When the neo-Orthodox theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote about the doctrine of original sin a number of years ago, he said that it is not just a theory, it is a demonstrable fact. And I quote him here when he said, "All I have to do is open up the daily paper, and I'm convinced again that there is something deeply wrong with humankind." Well, I have news for Reinhold, wherever he is today. The daily newspaper is a chronicle so often of the worst decisions people make and the evil things they do. Well, millions upon millions of kind acts are done which don't reach our notice. Some that have in recent months, of course, have come out during responses to the pandemic, the wonderful kind acts that we have seen. So whenever a compilation of stories comes out or something is highlighted about kindness, I say, hooray! We sometimes disappoint the devil. I don't believe in the doctrine of original sin, that we're condemned to be mean and evil, but there is a spark within most of all of us that can lead to kindness. So I really like the phrase. And it has helped me on occasion to do some of the things that the Random Acts of Kindness Foundation has suggested. Remember back when parking meters accepted coins? On a number of occasions, I put a quarter and a meter of someone parked near me whose meter had expired. Now, I learned later that this might have been against the law, but I've never regretted this bit of civil disobedience on my part. I was once in a restaurant with a group of people, and a couple at the next table was celebrating an anniversary. And we decided we'd order a bottle of champagne to be sent over to them. Now, as I recall, we didn't choose the most expensive bottle of champagne to send over, but I think it was a nice gesture that was much appreciated. And another one that I've done on a few occasions is where I'm in a supermarket and I have a lot of things in my basket, and coming to the checkout lane, if someone behind me has just a couple of articles, I'll say, why don't you go ahead of me? Which I think is a wonderful thing to do. And perhaps you've experienced this as well, as a really nice thing to do. Now, another thing that I haven't done, but I just read about a couple of weeks ago in, I think it was the New York Times, the practice of when you're going through a drive-through, like say McDonald's or Burger King, whatever, you pay for the person just behind you. And this particular article said that this had gone wild in one community where scores of people, one right after another, had done this. But of course, that's a nice gesture as well. A number of years ago, in one of my congregations, a reading group read the book, How Can I Help by Ram Dass, which encouraged us to ask people in need of assistance, how can I help? Now, perhaps you might think it is a dangerous question to ask, because someone may ask you to do something you are unable or unwilling to do. But Ram Dass suggests, well, you can always say that's not quite something I can do or I'm willing to do, but is there anything else I can do to help? But I remember one time, just after having read this book, I was visiting with a woman who was in desperate straits. Her husband was in the hospital, and she had just been released from the hospital after having experienced the fall. She had a cast on one arm, and the other arm wasn't feeling that great. And so in the next day or two, someone was going to come in to help her. But I asked her, what can I do to help? With a little bit of hesitancy, boy, what if she asks of something that I'm not willing to do or can't do? But she said to me, I'm worried about the plants out on the patio. It's likely to freeze tonight. Could you bring them in for me? And tomorrow's a pickup day for recycling. Could you bundle up the newspapers for me? Well, I was happy to do those tasks. She beamed, I beamed. It was an act of kindness, and over time we became fast friends. So I love stories of kindness. I look forward every Friday evening on CBS News with Nora O'Donnell, because their final story is from their roving reporter, Steve Hartman, who tells a story of some act of kindness in the tradition of Charles Corral, something I really love. And I cherish stories of kindness that people tell me. Galen Gingrich, who's senior minister of All Souls Unitarian Church in Manhattan, told me a story a few years ago that has stuck with me. At Christmas time, he was in a store in Manhattan, and he slipped on some steps, and he lost consciousness. And the next thing he knew, he awakened, and he was being attended to by a fellow who happened to be a physician. He said there was a big gash in his cheek, but the physician calmly assured him that he would likely be all right, that an ambulance was on the way, and that this gash could be sewn up. But then he said, upon reflection, if they bring you to an emergency room to sew you up, you could have a pretty bad scar. But he said, I'm very adept at this. This is my line of work, and I want you to come to my office. I can give you first-rate treatment to minimize that scar. And he did. Can you imagine that in the uncaring Manhattan we so often hear about? What an inspiring story about human kindness and goodness. I remember once, perhaps it was in his autobiography, where Frederick Douglass told about a visit to the famous 19th century skeptic, Robert Ingersoll, who challenged the Christian fundamentalism of his day. But Douglass rode all night on a train to get to Peoria, where Ingersoll lived, and he was a bit nervous about meeting this icon of agnosticism. Well, Ingersoll opened the door, and he had to quote Douglas, happiness and sunshine in his smile and kindness in his voice that were so welcoming. And you know, I say to myself, when new people come to my UU congregation for a service or to my office, do I have happiness and sunshine in my smile? And do I have kindness in my voice? I hope all of you do. I hope all of you do. I think it's helpful to recall how we have been on the receiving end of kind acts, because I think it encourages us to be alert to the ways that we can reciprocate. Just 19 years ago now, on a wintry Sunday morning, I was on my way to a guest, to give a guest sermon at a UU congregation in northern New Jersey. And I had to get off Interstate 80 onto the side road, and I made a mistake. It wasn't the proper side road. It was a road to a scenic overlook, which hadn't been plowed. And it was slippery. And I lost control of my car, went through a wooden restraining barrier and off over a cliff. I thought, is this it? Well, I hit a tree, which stopped me post haste. And of course, boy, thank goodness for airbags and shoulder restraints. And I scrambled up that incline. And later, state police said, how did you ever get up that incline to pull your car out of there? We had to send someone down on ropes to get it. But I came up, and there was a fellow who had been on that scenic overlook who had seen me go over, and he rushed up to me. And he said, can I call an ambulance for you? Well, I was feeling just really great pain. And so I said yes. And of course, the state police came along with the ambulance. But I didn't have the cell phone at the time. And he let me use his cell phone to call my wife to alert the church that I wasn't going to make it. And off I went to the emergency room. And unfortunately, the state police presented me with a citation for reckless driving, which claimed that the road had been clear. That fellow who had lent me his phone waited until he got his phone bill so he could call me to see if I was all right. And he said, and I told him about the citation. He said, I'm willing to write a letter, to the prosecutor and or the judge, saying that it was an ambiguous sign as to the exit and that it was not clear, but it was covered with snow and very slippery. And he sent me that letter, and I presented it to the prosecutor, and I presented it to the judge when I went to trial. And they reduced the reckless driving charge to obstruction of traffic. And I was so pleased at that act of kindness, which of course made a lot of difference to me in my driving record and my insurance charges. But then there's the whole issue of kindness that comes from the encouragement that others give us and that we give to others. I have another personal story in that regard. When I was serving the UU congregation in Silver Spring, Maryland, I was asked to be on the Institutional Review Board of the National Cancer Institute of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. And they were required by law to have a non-medical person on their review board, which reviewed all proposed research protocols. And I was told, when I took this on, that the main reason I was there is to review the informed consent documents to see that they properly conveyed the risks and possible values to the public. But before my second meeting with the board, the chair of the board said, well, I want you to do a review of a request for more accrual of patients to a particular research protocol. Well, I didn't think I was going to be asked to do this. So I brushed up on my statistics and I read all the documents. And this was a disastrous study. There were no positive results to it thus far, and there were many physical and psychological negative effects. So I recommended against any more accrual to the Institutional Review Board. And much to my dismay, the board voted against me. I couldn't believe it. Had I missed something? So I was in quite a quandary. But in just a couple of days, I got a letter from the chair of that Institutional Review Board, which said, "Thank you for joining our board. I appreciate the care with which you conducted your review. You raised significant issues." And then there was something to the effect that it was unlikely that this study would be continued. It was likely a dead study, but they commonly did not deny a request for more accrual. Well, I still think they made the wrong decision, but I was so pleased with the kindness of that chair to take time to write that helpful, explicit letter of gratitude. Now, I think so often have I taken the opportunity to encourage someone who is new at a task or a position to give them valuable feedback. Can be positive feedback and expression of gratitude. Now, he could have said, "Thank you for all of your diligence, but you might have considered such and such a point in your recommendation," and that would have been kind as well. But what a wonderful way this is to be kind. The week before last, my wife and I called a couple from our first congregation, of 40 years ago now, back in Minnesota, that we've kept up with over the years. And Beverly Jean was sharing something she had experienced where she has a particular need for a particular kind of shoe to be comfortable. And she has such difficulty getting this. And she had been in a store where the clerk had just knocked herself out to help her to get exactly what she needed. And she was so pleased, and she expressed her appreciation to this clerk. And she said, "I want you to tell me who your supervisor is, because I want to send a letter to your supervisor to express my appreciation for your wonderful, kind service." Now, wasn't that a nice thing to do? And how often, when we get fine service from someone, do we use this element of kindness to help them and to encourage them? Certainly a random act of kindness that we should suggest, that I suggest to all of you. It's so important, as it came out in our Wisdom for All Ages, to realize that acts of kindness beget acts of kindness. Beget acts of kindness. A number of years ago now, 13 years ago, I had the opportunity during my sabbatical to take a trip around the world. I had saved up enough Delta Airlines points so that I could travel around the world I had to watch my expenses. And so I determined that I would always take public transportation from the airport to my hotel, or in most cases, youth hostel I was staying at. And this worked out well in New Zealand, in Australia, and in China. It turns out, because I could understand the language in China, they at all the subways and metros, they had English for all of the stops, and all stops were given out in English as well as Chinese, and perhaps other languages as well. But when I got to Moscow, I asked the tourist information, how to get to the subway. And of course, the woman there said, "No, you don't want to take that. That's very, very cumbersome. Just take one of our taxis." And there were about 5 taxi drivers wanting my business. And I think the least amount I got them down to was $75. I didn't want to do that. So I finally got information about how to get to the subway. So I got to the subway, And I tried to ask several people, now, how do I get to this hotel? But I couldn't find anyone who spoke English. So reluctantly, I finally got on the subway, the end of the subway line, and said, what am I going to do? I have no idea. It was all Russian for all the stops. There was no way I could read it. But I noticed sitting next to me, talk about luck, there was a fellow, a younger fellow, who was reading an English soccer magazine. And I said, well, I'm in luck here. So he likely speaks English. And he did. And I asked him, can you tell me how to get to my hotel, which stops I should take or which transfers I should make? And he said, it's going to take you 3 transfers. It's going to be very, very difficult. I am going to take you there. And he did. And he went out of his way for 3 transfers. And finally, when I got to the last stop, I thanked him and said, I think I can find my hotel from here. And he said, no, I want to take you to the front door of that hotel. And he did. And I reached in my pocket to take out some rubles to give him. And he just forcefully said, no, I don't want any money. Now, going back to my elementary school years with the duck and cover drills because I was fearful that the Russians were going to obliterate us. And that's, of course, in the back of your mind when you travel in Russia, even today, to find that degree of kindness. But when I got back to New York, shortly after, there was a tourist who was puzzling over a map and show that kindness begets kindness. I went up to that person and said, can I help you find what you're looking for? And he told me what he's looking for. And I said, I'll take you there. I walked him all the way to where he was going. Kindness begets kindness. And this comes out in a wonderful article I read a number of years ago from Art Buchwald. Remember Art Buchwald? He had such wonderful columns. But he was traveling with a friend in a cab in New York City. And after the trip ended, his friend said to the driver, I want to thank you for your superb job at driving us here. And the cab driver replied, are you a wise guy or something? No, he said, I'm very serious. I admire the way you handle this tough traffic to get us here safely. Well, they paid their fare and left the cab. And then Buchwald said to his friend, he said, why were you so effusive in your praise? And he said, well, it's just my modus operandi in life. He said, I figure that comment, that praise, made the cab driver's day. And say he picked up 20 or so fares during the day, and he is kind to those people, and they in turn are kind to the people they work with, and later to their families. I think I could have positively affected the lives of 1,000 people by those words. Well, Buchwald was a bit dubious, and he said, you're depending a lot upon that cab driver. And his friend replied, not really. I'm going to say similar things to at least 10 other people today, and at least 3 of them are going to come through for me. So I'll affect at least 300 people positively by my words of kindness. Isn't that an interesting story? Now, random acts of kindness, of course, are not planned, but they meet all of the features of kindness that William Henricks mentions in his book, Kindness in the Good Society. They are voluntary. They are not coerced. They meet the needs of another person without any ulterior motive. I am all for random acts of kindness and commend them to them. A wonderful resolution for all of us. Realize if you screw up one time, you're going to have many, many other opportunities to follow through on your resolution. I have to mention, of course, that sometimes what might appear kind on the surface is the most unkind thing you can do for a person. There once was a big ad in the New York Times that said, you could be killing an addict with kindness by enabling their addiction, as Dostoevsky's wife Anna did with his gambling addiction. She scrimped on household expenses so she would have funds to bail him out of his gambling debts, and thus really uh, didn't didn't mean that he had to come to grips with his addiction. But I remember once many years ago getting a call from a parishioner, now probably 35 years ago, and she said, "Will you come and pick me up at the state hospital and give me a ride home?" It was about 40 miles away. And on the surface, it would have been a kind thing to do. But I knew the total story. She was a chronic alcoholic and had been rescued many times by members of the congregation without our insisting that she seek treatment. Finally, in a drunken state, she had attempted suicide and had been brought to the state hospital and detained there. And I went to testify at her commitment hearing. And I told her counselor, I said, she really needs to get into alcoholic treatment or she is going to die. And I think you should make sure that she goes there from her time in the hospital here. And I knew what her medical insurance was, and I had found a treatment center that would accept her insurance. And I gave that to him. I said, you should insist that she do this. But they hadn't insisted, or she hadn't agreed to do it. And so she was calling me. And I said, I will not pick you up unless you will go to such and such treatment program that I had lined up for her. And I said, I'm going to call the folks at the church and suggest that none of them pick you up unless you agree to go into treatment. Now, she could have asked other people other than the church, I suppose, but she did agree. And she went through treatment and she entered a long-term recovery program and was sober for 3 years until she succumbed to heart disease. And she thanked me a number of times for this discerning kindness, which I offered to her. Now, in highlighting random acts of kindness, I'm not denigrating in any way well-planned and well-executed kindness, which so many of my congregations have exhibited, volunteering at food banks, visiting people in hospitals, providing transportation, helping people to get shelter. 2 of my congregations have worked very closely with Family Promise to get longer-term help for homeless families. These are wonderful programs, but I something is to be said for random acts of kindness, which present themselves to us every day. And of course, kindness is not only important in the moral realm, it has cash value, as William James would say. I was fascinated a number of years ago to read a study that in 1995, a study done at Bell Labs in New Jersey about effective engineers and managers. And they found a strong correlation between kindness and effectiveness in times of crisis. Effectiveness was not correlated to the graduate program the person had come from, or their grades, or their general intelligence. It was correlated with their kindness. They were trusted because they were kind, and they became the center of communication at times of crisis within the organization. I close now with a story from the Talmud, that repository of ancient Jewish legend, about how the site for the holy city of Jerusalem was established. And the story, which I love so much, goes like this. There once were 2 brothers who farmed together. They had their fields together, and they would harvest their grain together. They had separate granaries, however, half to one brother's granary and one half to the other. One brother was single, and the other brother had several children. Well, the single brother said to himself, it's not fair that this should be a 50-50 arrangement, because I only have myself to care for. But my brother has his entire family. He has to provide for several people. And so at night, he periodically would go to the granaries and take grain from his bin and place it in his brother's bin. Now, the other brother began to think of how he had all these children to provide for him in his old age, and his brother had no one. So he said, it's not fair, really, that this should be a 50-50 proposition. So from time to time, he would take grain from his bin and place it in his brother's bin. Well, one night, as fate would have it, they bumped into each other and embraced each other in love and kindness. This, said Yahweh, is a place for my holy city. May such kindness be evident in us and among us in this new year. So may it be.